The roar of motorcycles broke the evening calm, like thunder on a quiet night. Granny Agnes stood in the middle of the empty parking lot, frozen in place while clutching her small bag of groceries. Her eyes darted around, trying to understand why these bikes had circled her like a group of wolves closing in on their prey. Their headlights were bright, shining right in her face, and she had to squint to see the menacing figures on the roaring machines. Their laughter echoed in the still air, and their voices carried a sneer she could feel in her bones. Granny Agnes felt her heart pound, so hard she feared it might burst out of her chest. She had never felt so exposed and afraid in her entire life. She was alone. The streetlights flickered now and then, making the biker shadows look bigger and more frightening than they already were. It felt like time itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Granny Agnes was a humble woman in her 70s. She lived by herself in a small house at the end of the street. Her husband had passed away 5 years ago, leaving her with her 4 sons, who had all grown and moved out. They loved her very much, but they had their own lives, families, and work. Still, each son tried to visit whenever they could, and they all called her often, checking on her health and happiness. Granny Agnes was proud of her sons and never wanted to bother them with her problems. She believed in being strong and solving little matters on her own. But that night, she felt very small and helpless. The men on the motorcycles wore leather jackets and boots. Their hair was long, and their eyes were filled with mischief. Granny Agnes had come from the supermarket and had stayed a little later than usual. By the time she was done, most of the parking lot was empty. She walked slowly toward her car, which was parked in the far corner. That was when she first heard the low rumble of engines. She tried to walk faster, but her old legs did not let her move as quickly as she wished. The bikers saw her, and for reasons only they knew, they decided she was a good target for their taunts. The tallest biker got off his motorcycle and walked over to her. He had a cruel smirk on his face. His boots made a loud sound each time he took a step on the concrete. Granny Agnes held her bag of groceries close to her chest, as though it could shield her. Her shoulders tensed, and her mind raced. She had never been in such a position before, facing strangers who meant her harm. She prayed silently for courage. She knew how to pray. She had always done, so whenever life felt too big. Right now, she needed all the help she could get. "Hey, Grandma," the tall biker said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You look a bit lost. Need help carrying your bag?" He reached out, grabbing the corner of her grocery bag. His fingers grazed hers, and she nearly jumped. She could smell the cigarette smoke in his jacket, and it made her feel queasy. Another biker laughed behind him, a harsh, barking sound. It was so loud in the quiet night. Granny Agnes tried to speak, but her voice came out in a trembling whisper. "No, thank you," she managed. "I can carry it myself." Her words hardly mattered to them, though. Another biker revved his engine, filling the air with a snarling sound. The tall biker pulled at the grocery bag, and Granny Agnes lost her grip. It fell to the ground, oranges and canned goods spilling out. She hurried to pick them up, her hands shaking. That was when the rest of them got off their motorcycles. There were 6 in total, and each one had a sneer or a mocking grin. They surrounded her, making it difficult for her to walk away. She felt trapped. They made jokes about her age, her careful steps, and her obvious fear. They laughed as she scrambled to collect her scattered items. One even kicked a can further away, so she had to hobble a few more steps to reach it. When she finally stood up, she noticed how her knees trembled. Her breath was shaky. She clutched her keys in her hand, trying to remember where she had parked her car. The lights from the motorcycles almost blinded her, making it hard to see. All she could think was, "I just want to get away from here." She tried to walk, but a biker stepped into her path. Another blocked her from behind. Someone snatched the bag from her hand again. The tall biker rifled through it and pulled out her loaf of bread. He waved it in front of her face. "Grandma's dinner," he teased, tossing it back and forth with another biker. It was all a cruel game to them. Granny Agnes's heart pounded even harder. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. "This can't be happening," she thought. She wondered if she could scream for help, but nobody else was around. The store was closed, and the few cars left in the parking lot were empty. She looked around for any sign of a security guard or passerby, but there was none. "Please," she said, voice trembling. I just need to go home." One of the bikers, a red-haired man with stubble on his chin, mimicked her trembling voice. I just need to go home," he mocked, pretending to be afraid, then laughed a harsh laugh that was echoed by the others. Granny Agnes's eyes watered. She wanted to maintain her dignity, but the fear was so strong it brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them away, hoping they would not notice, but it was too late. "Oh, look," a biker jeered. "She's about to cry." That was the moment Granny Agnes felt a flicker of anger push through her fear. She might be old, but she was not weak. She thought of the house she built with her husband, the nights she stayed up taking care of her boys when they were children, the jobs she worked to help support her family. She had lived through many tough times, and she had learned not to give up easily. So she did what she had to. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her cell phone. "What's that, Grandma?" "You gonna call the cops?" the tall biker asked, amused. He leaned in to read the screen. Granny Agnes's hands were still shaking, but she managed to swipe the phone open. Instead of the police, she dialed her eldest son, David. The phone rang once, and the tall biker snatched it away. But Granny Agnes had already pressed the speaker button. "Mom." David's worried voice came through the phone. "Mom, are you okay?" She did not have to say a word. The sounds of the biker's laughter filled the phone call, and David knew this was not some harmless situation. Granny Agnes heard his tone shift. "Mom, talk to me," he repeated. Then more urgently, "Mom, who are these people? Where are you?" The tall biker ended the call, but Granny Agnes saw that the phone screen changed to an active location-sharing feature that David had helped set up for her months ago. She did not fully understand how it worked, but David had insisted it was for emergencies. Now, it seemed like it might save her. Granny Agnes squared her shoulders. "I just called my son," she said quietly, lifting her chin. "He'll be here soon." She had 3 more sons as well, each of them living within driving distance. Once David knew something was wrong, he would call them too. She was certain of that. The bikers went silent for a moment, exchanging quick glances. Then one shrugged. "So what?" he muttered. "We have time." That was enough to send a wave of terror through Granny Agnes's heart again, but she clung to the hope that David was coming. David was her firstborn, tall and strong. He had learned discipline from a young age, and had always watched out for his younger siblings. Then there was Peter, the second son, who was calm and focused, a quiet man who worked with computers, but knew how to keep a level head in any crisis. The third son, Mark, was a bit of a daredevil, and had even done some boxing in his younger years. The youngest, Eric, had a kind heart but was fierce when pushed too far. Together, these 4 men protected their mother like the center of their world. Time felt like it was standing still. Granny Agnes could not say how many minutes passed, but she felt each second like a heavy weight in her chest. The bikers kept taunting her, pushing her back and forth between them, snatching her groceries whenever she tried to collect them. One of them took her purse and rummaged through it, pulling out her old wallet. Another started to flick the wallet open and closed, grinning as Granny Agnes's driver's license fell to the ground. "Hey, your name's Agnes," he said with a sneer. "I've never met an Agnes before." A few minutes later, the tallest biker seemed restless. "No cops, no security, no one is coming," he said, picking up her phone again. "Let's see if your son left any messages." He opened the phone, but Granny Agnes had locked it with a code that only she and her sons knew. The man frowned and tossed the phone aside. Then he looked at his group. "We should go," he said. That might have been Granny Agnes's chance to slip away without much harm, but 2 of them looked to be in no rush to leave. They seemed to enjoy seeing her fear. One even hopped onto the hood of a nearby parked car, leaning back as though he were watching a performance. "We got nowhere to be," he said. "Why not have some fun?" Suddenly, a sharp, shrill noise cut through the air. It was the sound of a car taking a tight turn into the parking lot at high speed, tires screeching. Granny Agnes recognized the black SUV at once. It was David's. Her heart leaped with relief, but the bikers only tensed and braced themselves, not yet running away. The SUV's headlights swept over the group. The vehicle skidded to a stop several feet away, and the driver's side door flew open. David, tall and broad-shouldered, jumped out first. Behind him, Mark was already coming from the passenger side, with a firm look in his eyes. Another car pulled up right beside them, Peter's silver sedan. Eric scrambled out from the back seat. All 4 of Granny Agnes's sons had arrived. They looked at their mother, standing in the middle of these strangers who had cornered her. Anger flashed across their faces. Granny Agnes felt tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. She did not care if she cried now. Her boys were here. For a moment, the tension was so strong that nobody moved. The bikers sized up the 4 men who stood protectively in front of their mother. David stepped closer, fists clenched at his sides. Mark stood next to him with his arms tensed, ready. Peter had his jaw set, and Eric's face showed a mixture of rage and worry. The tall biker turned to the others and nodded in a silent command. 2 more of them moved forward, ready to challenge David and Mark, while one tried to circle around to face Peter and Eric. Granny Agnes drew in a quick breath, fearing an all-out brawl would happen right there in the parking lot. She did not want her sons hurt, nor did she want them to get into legal trouble. But she knew they would fight to protect her. She shouted, "Boys, please be careful." But each of her sons kept their focus on the men around them. The tall biker took a swing at David, but David dodged it with a quick step. Mark lunged at another biker who tried to rush him from the side. The scene turned into a blur of movement. Although Granny Agnes's sons were outnumbered, they had the advantage of surprise and the fury of men who had found their mother in danger. She could see how Peter moved swiftly, grabbing a biker's arm and pushing him away before he could strike. Eric, though he was the youngest, showed no fear as he ducked a punch and swung back, landing a blow in the biker's side. Granny Agnes's heart thundered in her ears. She could hardly breathe. She had prayed for rescue, but she never wanted things to get violent. Yet she could see no other way. The bikers had made their choice. The scuffle felt like it lasted forever, but in truth, it was over in moments. Some of the bikers stumbled, groaning from hits they had not expected. One scrambled to his feet, picking up his jacket from the ground. Another crawled toward his motorcycle. The tall biker, clutching his bruised face, glared at David. David stood firm, chest rising and falling with sharp, angry breaths. Behind David, Mark, Peter, and Eric all stepped forward, forming a wall. It was a silent warning. Do not dare touch our mother again. The tall biker spat on the ground, then gestured to the others to leave. Granny Agnes watched as they picked themselves up, mumbling curses under their breath. They threw one more hateful look at her and her sons, then turned to their motorcycles. Engine started, and the roar filled the air again. Within seconds, they were riding off into the distance, red taillights disappearing in the night. Granny Agnes finally let out the breath she had been holding. Her knees almost gave out, and David rushed to hold her up. Mark gently patted her shoulder, asking if she was hurt. Peter and Eric picked up the groceries scattered around. She tried to speak, but only tears came. After a moment, she managed to say, "Thank you, my dear boys." The group turned to look at the damage. The groceries were mostly ruined, the bread crushed, and a few cans dented. Granny Agnes's purse was on the ground, contents half spilled. There was a long scratch on the car parked next to them where one of the bikers had sat. David picked up her phone. The screen was cracked, but it still lit up with an incoming message. It was from him, sent during the rush, asking for her location. Granny Agnes gave a shaky laugh at the irony that she had not needed to read it once they arrived. Together, they made sure she was safe and not physically harmed. She had a few bruises on her arms where one of the bikers had grabbed her, and her legs were shaking, but she was alive. She was grateful beyond words. They helped her into Peter's car, deciding to leave her small vehicle there for a while. Mark said he would drive it home later. For now, they wanted Granny Agnes to rest while they took her back to her warm house. On the ride home, she tried to compose herself, brushing away her tears and thanking them. Each son just looked at her with love in his eyes. When they got to her cozy little house, they helped her inside, setting her on her favorite chair in the living room. The lamp cast a soft glow, making the space feel safe and comforting. Mark went to the kitchen and made tea, while Eric started picking up the newspaper and knitting supplies scattered on the table, trying to make the area tidy so Granny Agnes could feel calm. Peter checked her bruises with concern. David pulled up a chair next to her and put a blanket over her lap. Once she had taken a few sips of tea, Granny Agnes recounted the whole event with a voice that still trembled. The memory was fresh, and she could not help but feel a chill run through her. She told them about how she had stayed late at the store, how the bikers surrounded her, how they had laughed at her, and made her feel powerless. Each of her sons listened quietly. She saw David's fist clench from time to time, saw Mark's eyes darken with anger at her mistreatment, noticed the worried set of Peter's jaw, and felt the comforting grip Eric had on her hand. They all agreed that the next step was to call the police and report what had happened. Granny Agnes hesitated, not wanting any more trouble, but David insisted. "Mom, they can't get away with this," he said firmly. "If they do it to you, they might do it to someone else, too." So Granny Agnes made the call. She spoke softly yet clearly, describing the attack and explaining where it happened. The dispatcher promised to send someone to take a statement. David and Mark decided they would be there when the police arrived, to share what they witnessed when they came in at the end. Granny Agnes felt a wave of relief. She was no longer alone in this. Her sons were strong, but even more importantly, they were there for her in her time of need. She realized then that it was nearly 10 o'clock at night. The day had turned out in a way she never could have expected. She looked down at her shaky hands, reminded of the time she had learned to ride a bike with her father's help as a child. Back then, falling off the bicycle felt like the end of the world. Now, this truly felt terrifying. But she also felt a surge of love and gratitude. God bless my boys, she thought. What would I do without them? Soon, a patrol car pulled up outside. An officer came in and took a statement, listening carefully to the story. David gave a few details about the number of men, their appearance, and which direction they left. Mark mentioned how they had to step in to protect their mother. The officer took notes and kindly told Granny Agnes they would look into the matter. They could not promise the bikers would be found right away, but at least a record would be on file, and the area around the store would get extra patrol for a while. After the officer left, the house fell quiet. Peter and Eric looked at Granny Agnes with gentle smiles. David placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mom, we're going to stay here with you tonight," he said. "We can set up in the living room. You won't be alone." Granny Agnes felt tears of gratitude again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked. "I don't know what I did to deserve such wonderful sons." She tried to protest that they all had work the next day, but they would not hear of leaving her alone after such a terrible event. They also helped her realize that she might need a few days of rest to recover from the shock. Granny Agnes finally gave in. She was actually relieved to know they would be there. She changed into her nightgown and got into her bed. The warmth of the blankets seemed much sweeter now that she felt secure. She closed her eyes, letting herself drift off to sleep, aware that she was no longer in danger. The next morning, she woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and scrambled eggs. She walked into the kitchen to find Peter cooking, Eric setting the table, David reading the newspaper, and Mark finishing a phone call in the hallway. The sight filled her with love. She sat down, a little sore from the bruises, but feeling better in her spirit. One by one, her sons came by to give her a kiss on the forehead or a warm hug. They ate breakfast like a big family again, just like in the old days. Granny Agnes glanced at the window. The sun was shining brightly, and birds were chirping in the garden. She felt a sense of peace that had been missing the night before. This was what mattered in life: family, love, and safety. She bowed her head for a moment, grateful that the danger was gone and that no one had been seriously hurt. Later, they drove back to the store parking lot to get her car. David made sure to accompany her. Her small vehicle was still there, untouched. She felt a pang of worry, remembering how frightened she had been in that spot just hours ago. David gently squeezed her hand and said, "Mom, you're safe. We're here. Nobody's going to hurt you." He opened the driver's door for her. She slid into the seat, took a breath, and started the engine. It purred to life as though nothing bad had ever happened there. She pulled out of the parking lot, following David, who drove ahead in his SUV. In the days that followed, Granny Agnes found herself replaying the moment she first saw those headlights in the lot. She would wake up sweating in the middle of the night, certain she heard the rumble of motorcycles outside. Each time, she would remind herself that her doors were locked, the police were aware, and her sons were just a phone call away. It took time, but gradually she felt safe again. Her sons took turns visiting each day for the next week, making sure she was never alone for long. They helped with chores, replaced her broken phone, and insisted she carry pepper spray. "Just in case," Mark said, pressing it into her hand. She did not like the idea of using it, but she also did not want to be caught off guard again. One afternoon, a neighbor dropped by to bring flowers. News traveled fast in a small community. Some neighbors had heard about what happened and wanted to show their support. Granny Agnes was touched by their kindness. She thanked them and felt a little braver each time someone showed care. She realized she was not alone in this world. Life slowly returned to normal, but a new sense of caution stayed with Granny Agnes. She never went shopping late at night anymore. If she needed something, she either asked a neighbor or one of her sons to go with her. She understood that being careful did not mean she was weak. It meant she was smart enough to protect herself. And her sons, too, felt a renewed sense of duty toward her. They often reminded each other to check on her, invite her to dinner, and include her in family plans. A couple of weeks later, she stood on her porch with a gentle breeze brushing her face. She watched the sun set behind the houses across the street. The sky was painted with soft oranges and pinks, and a single star twinkled in the distance. She thought about the bikers, where they might be, what led them to pick on an old woman. She still felt a twinge of fear thinking about that night, but now it was overshadowed by gratitude. She was grateful for her family, for the kindness of her neighbors, and for her own quiet strength that helped her survive. One evening, while she was reading a book in her living room, her phone rang. She picked it up, expecting one of her sons. Instead, it was the police officer who had taken her statement. He told her that they had identified and found two of the men from that night. They had faced charges for harassment and attempted robbery. The officer said the men admitted they had made a bad choice that night. The matter would go to court in a few months. When Granny Agnes hung up, she sat quietly, thinking about how these men might face real consequences. She felt no pity for them, but she also felt no joy in their downfall. She only hoped that this would stop them from hurting anyone else. In her heart, she believed in second chances, but she also believed people needed to learn from their mistakes. That night, she told her sons the news. They nodded. Mark joked, "I bet they never expected to face 4 angry sons when they messed with a little old lady." That made Granny Agnes laugh, and it felt good to laugh about the whole event, to feel some lightness after all the fear. Months passed, and the incident became a story in the family. Sometimes, during gatherings, one of her sons would bring it up, and they would remind each other how important it was to stay united. Granny Agnes would think back to the moment she dialed David's number, her hand trembling. She remembered hearing his voice on the speaker, filled with alarm and love. She remembered the relief she felt when all 4 of them showed up, saving her from the bikers. She remembered the strong arms that held her and the voices that reassured her everything would be okay. She realized this event had brought them even closer as a family. It reminded her sons that life can be unpredictable and that their mother, though tough in spirit, could still be vulnerable. It made them vow to visit her more often and be there for her in any way they could. And it reminded Granny Agnes that it was okay to lean on loved ones, that asking for help was not a burden, but a shared joy in a caring family. One afternoon, about a year after the attack, Granny Agnes and her 4 sons gathered in her backyard for a barbecue. The weather was warm, the sky clear. Grandchildren played on the grass, laughing and chasing one another. The smell of grilled food filled the air. She sat in a comfortable lawn chair, wrapped in a light shawl, watching the scene with contentment. David and Mark flipped burgers on the grill, while Peter helped the kids set up a small game. Eric handed her a glass of cold lemonade. She looked around at her family and felt a profound sense of peace. The memory of that terrifying night was still there, tucked away in the back of her mind. But it no longer haunted her. Instead, it was a reminder of how precious safety and love could be. When the grandchildren asked why Grandma always made sure to do her shopping during the daytime, she simply smiled and said, "Because I'm older and wiser now, and I have wonderful sons who watch out for me." The family laughter rose in the air like music. Granny Agnes closed her eyes and took in the joyful sounds. She was surrounded by the people she loved. She had faced a terrible moment of fear and helplessness, but she had come out stronger and more grateful. In the distance, she heard the faint hum of a motorcycle passing by on the main road. It did not scare her anymore. It was just another noise in the world. She had her family's protection, and they had her love. In that moment, she realized her story was not one of tragedy, but one of hope. Even the darkest night could end in a bright dawn. And she would never forget how the bikers stopped laughing the second she called her 4 sons. That moment of turning from terror to relief was now a lesson in faith and family. She vowed to keep living, enjoying the simple things, and never taking love for granted again. She took a sip of lemonade and let out a long breath. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in warm shades of gold and purple. Her sons cheered as the food finished cooking. Grandchildren ran up to her, asking for a hug. And Granny Agnes, with a heart full of gratitude, happily obliged. They might face other hardships in life, but they would face them together. That was all that mattered in the end.